So we left off talking about how you select clientele to represent and what has to be sort of their needs, of how you can meet their needs and how they can perhaps fulfill what you need in a client. So you want to talk about that?
Well, I don't think I'm very different from anyone else in my position as an attorney or in the representation business, is that, you want your clients to be successful. Mm-hmm. So you hope first and foremost that you pick people who have the ability to kind of deliver ultimately. It is important to me that I buy into the client's creative. I don't think I could be a person who could just represent anyone who did anything, and that might come across as being, I don't know, snobby or, but it just, I think it's just a function of, I really do care a lot about the arts. I mean, when you think about it, we could be lawyers doing anything. I don't think you could be agents for the most part doing anything, or producers doing anything. But once you decide as a lawyer that this is something you want to do, as opposed to all the other things you could do in the legal profession, there should be a reason for having made this choice. And my reason in part is not only because this interests me and my aptitude for it, but also because I love the arts. And they were an important part of my life, and to be part of furthering someone's dream is important. So those are the kinds of things that motivate me. I also have, as one would expect, a significant number of women and a significant number of women of all kinds and people of color of all kinds. And that really is a function because I'm probably a bit more attractive to those people, especially since they're not going to find, up until fairly recently, and in some cases still not at all, that level of diversity and inclusion in the rest of the representation business, meaning in the agencies and the management firms. Absolutely changing as to the agencies, not so much as to the management firms.
What would be something that you would say no to taking on someone as a client?
For a long time, until and I'm still very discerning, I'm not as interested in representing minors. It's a complicated situation with minors because, a few of them are in the business because they just have no alternative. It is who they are and who they will always be. I think about clients of mine like Lawrence Fishburne, who, while I didn't represent him as a child because we're too close in age, or Nick Cannon, who I did represent as a child, or Marcus Scribner on Blackish, who I now represent, and who is, just turned 18 and coming into his adulthood. In all of those cases, in the case of both Nick and Marcus, they both had just these wonderful parents who supported their art and still wanted to be their parents. And also, they were kids who I thought, this is what they were really meant to do. So that's one thing that's important to me.
So in terms of buying into creativity, there's some artists you've been with since very early in their career. So I'm curious what you saw in like a Jamie Foxx early on.
Yeah, Jamie and I were together for about 20 years. And it was at a time when I was representing, I was, you have to find your in. And my in has often been meeting people early in their careers when others might not be as interested in them. And really kind of seeking out that talent and making the alliances with the talent and with their other representatives. And that was very much the case of Jamie. He had managers who I'd come to know because they were involved in some other projects I was doing. And then when Jamie started working on Living Color, which is when I started representing him, and that show became a big hit, and then all these other opportunities became open to him. But people in the comedian world were at one time a much more easier way in. I mean, one of the issues you have to realize about representation, which we don't talk about that often, is it's a club for a reason and a boys' club for a reason. People tend to refer to the people they know and like, which tend to be people like them. And if you're not like them, you're not going to get the referrals, just plain and simple. So often I get the referrals because nowadays, because I'm so well known, but in the early days, because I was just out there early on in people's careers, sometimes before they got agents or managers. They had a deal and I would make the deal and I would be the only representative.
Can you talk about how you relate to a talent agent and a manager, and what the lawyer's role is in navigating those relationships, and who's really...
Well, you know, in the best of all worlds, you are a great team, and it's like you pass the baton, and in each instance, the person who has the baton has to kind of carry it, and but you're constantly passing it among each other, and in the best of all worlds, the sum of your individual efforts is more than three, and certainly more than one. I think as I was preparing to do this, I went and I looked back at Bernie Brillstein, who was someone who I really adored, and he said he was asked the difference between an agent and a manager. And he said there's no difference at all. And if agents did their jobs, they wouldn't need managers. It's just.
But legally, there's a difference, right?
But he points out in his remarks that legally there is a difference, and that agents are the people who are supposed to procure employment, and managers are the people who are supposed to guide careers. Most people do, putting those kind of strict definitions aside. Most managers do tend to be involved in a more day in, day out basis in the way that agents, because they have a much larger client list, often cannot. However, you know, a good agent who's covering the marketplace and knows what people want to make and has the relationships with executives and others is a huge and important part of the team. And I tend to have good relationships with both agents and managers. And when I find people who fit well, I'm really thrilled when I can work with them time and time again.
Mm. And what about, well, I'm going to talk about Ava DuVernay in a minute, but with her, you seem to have more of a creative role with her too, and as an advisor.
She likes to think that, but she's got so many wonderful people who advise her.
Is that unusual,
well,
or is that something
I don't think it's
so
much that it, first of all, I am very, very clear. Like a lot of people used to ask me, not so much anymore because I'm so known for being a lawyer, what do you want to do next? And I would always say, this is what I want to do next. I love doing this. This is fun. But I've always been really, really a fan of the arts. You know, as I described earlier, going to the theater, seeing half the show, sometimes seeing the whole show. But also I was very fortunate because during the time I was growing up, there were a lot of private and public opportunities that supported the arts. So like, for example, I went to Leonard Bernstein's Young Artist, artist development. I went to see the New York City Ballet with the Police Athletic League. I had a real, I lived in New York, as I've said, and my mom thought that museums were babysitters, and a rainy day was an opportunity to send you to the Met. A snowy day was an opportunity to send you to the planetarium because it was closer to us. I mean, it was just, this was really a part of our lives. So I feel that over time, I developed, my own artistic sensibility as a member of the audience. Mm. So so often clients will ask me things because they know I see everything. I go to New York, I see 3 plays in a weekend. I see almost all the movies that come out. I watch television. In a part we didn't discuss, and I don't want to go into in tremendous detail, but the way I worked and made a living through the latter half of high school, college, and lots of law school is that I was actually a fitting model in the garment district. And as a result of that, I met a lot of people in the arts. Mm. And that's how I really was able to really augment my scholarship in college. I would take a week off and I would work the markets and things like that.
Yeah, because so you worked your way through, but you had some scholarships too, and some...
Oh, absolutely. My family didn't have any money to send me to college or law school. I got there through scholarships, loans, and I was paying off my student loans for 20 years after I got out of school.
Wow. Well worth it, though.
Well worth it, but...
Going back to Jamie Foxx for a second,
Mm-hmm.
As his fame grew and he started getting movie deals and he was still on Living Color, and had some music success, what was different about the negotiation process for you?
Well, I think the seminal moment for him, and this is something that we were leading up to for quite some time, was the negotiation for the movie that became Ray, which had actually been bouncing around for some time. And this is often the case, you know, with a movie. It's almost like you have to wait for the star to be born or the star to come to ascendancy, and it was just the best of everything. You know, his musical ability, his acting ability, it all just combined. And from then on, he was, you know, a major star and commanded major star deals, and that wasn't particularly difficult, except that it's always difficult in trying to figure out, you know, kind of what to, not so much what to ask for, you know what to ask for because you do your homework and you have experience, but, you know, just the juggling of all the things that are, you know, the different projects that people want to do. It's kind of like F. Gary Gray, who is someone who I've also represented since the very beginning of his career. And, you know, having most recently done Fate of the Furious and now in prep for the new Men in Black movie, you know, that's a lot of ground and that's a long way from Friday.
What's the biggest differences between negotiating for talent, film, and television?
You know, in some ways, when you think about it, the film experience now isn't really that much different from the film experience of 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's still a collective experience where you sit in a room with a bunch of other people and you watch a screen. Now, the technology has gotten better, the choices have become, in some ways, more diverse, but it's still a one-off type of experience. The television experience has become almost indescribable. We watch it in our homes, we watch it on our phones, we watch it on our tablets, we listen to it. We experience it in so many different ways. There's so many different players in that business. There's so much more product. There's so many different ways to structure the deal. The notion of early television where, you know, you were going to get hired on a show, you were going to go for 6 or 7 seasons, you were going to do 22 or 24 episodes a season, and then it was over, you were going to go on to the next thing, and if you were really lucky, the show was successful, you negotiated somewhere before the end, you made a lot of money, the show made a lot of money. That type of deal very rarely happens in that way anymore. Now you have all kinds of short episodes, you have the ability really to do more than one show if the exclusivity provisions of your agreement permit it. It's just a very different experience, and now there are different marketplaces. You know, when you look at a show and say, you don't look at a movie and say, that's not a movie. Well, you do. You say it can't play in theaters, and it's not a movie. But if it can play in theaters, it's a movie. But in television, it can be a network show. It can be a basic cable show. It can be a cable show. It could be a streaming show. It could be any number of places where it rightfully belongs. It can be a short order series that must end, you know. The Crown will end, right? And for those 2 actors who originated the role, it has ended for them, and now it resumes. That never would have happened. Nowhere would you switch leads kind of halfway. Think about that. When you think, I mean, it makes sense, but in years past, you would have just age progressed them. But now it's a much more authentic type of experience. So television has changed a lot. The movie making, the kind of experience of movies has not changed. The making of movies has changed. You know?
Yeah. Have you had to change your negotiation style or tactics because of all of these new different
my
aspects?
negotiating style, like many people who negotiate, is what it is. It tends to vary based on the amount of leverage I have. It tends to vary based on my knowledge of what the other side will and can give. It often changes based on who I'm speaking to and what I know about their individual proclivities and how they like to negotiate. But the knowledge you need to negotiate a good deal is what changes. And your ability to understand, it's like you have to understand everything. Like, I read, obviously, our trade publications, but I also read the business section of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal almost every day. And sometimes I read them online, but for the most part, I still read, especially the New York Times, because I get it here in my office. I still read the paper version, but I'm constantly researching and reading and understanding and reading articles and listening to things about the economics and the changes in the business.
I mean, yeah, because you started, there were 3 networks.
Yeah.
And that was it.
And then there were 4. And then there were, and then there was cable, premium pay cable, like HBO and Showtime. And then,
Yeah, because I imagine a lot of those early deals never could have foreseen what kind of distribution outlets there would be now and what exclusivity means.
Right. Right.
So what have been the biggest challenges for you to catch yourself up to speed on, or that anything
I
catch you
think-
by surprise? That
There don't tend to be, at least I don't feel like there are huge shifts. I think that it's a tide, and it goes, and you can see it. And so, does it catch you by surprise? Not like, oh my God, all of that has changed. No, you realize that things are changing, and if you're a good and astute negotiator, you stay on top of it. But I will tell you that as we look at issues of consolidation, vertical integration, all of those things have had an impact. Now we're moving into a whole new era where the agency business has almost become, for the very, very top agencies, almost the tail that wags the dog as they look to go into other businesses and have gone into other businesses. Mm-hmm. When you look at the businesses that WME and CAA, for example, are building in the sports world, in the professional, the professional, the sports representation in the professional sports world, the licensing of athletes and others, these are businesses that in some ways can and will probably eclipse the core business. So
yeah, I want to talk about endorsements. Going back to the Barbie that you used to sew dresses for.
Now I have Barbies that my clients are.
Exactly. Talk about Misty Copeland and what concerns you have for associating one of your clients with a brand and a commercial product, and what goes into a deal like that.
Misty's an enormously interesting example of how, and something we haven't really talked about, is how the digital world has made access to people positive, in the sense of, I don't know that a lone ballerina in a New York ballet company would have 20, 30 years ago been able to have the kind of exposure that Misty has had. Would she have been newsworthy, and would she have perhaps been covered by the press of that era? Of course she would, as her proceedings were covered. But I don't think that she would ever have this, that Under Armour digital commercial really made her a household name.
Yeah.
And more importantly, from our perspective, did wonderful things for Under Armour, for which they should always be grateful to Misty.
Have you ever had a client going the other way that had a negative representation or some sort of infringing use or unauthorized use of their name likeness?
Every day.
Every day.
Every day. Who doesn't?
Right.
We regularly scour the internet for infringing uses of our clients' names and likenesses. We're in a constant kind of almost a whack-a-mole battle to have websites taken down, fraudulent Facebook pages, fraudulent Twitter accounts. It's a never-ending battle. Yeah, so all the time.
What's changed in the legal landscape with right of publicity cases like that? I mean,
well, it's like everything else. The more use you as the talent make of something, the less, in a way, precious it becomes. So if you make constant use of your name and likeness, for example, in social media, it becomes much harder for you to ask other people not to make use and likeness of it, make use of it, unless, of course, they're doing it in a way that misappropriates or misinterprets who you are or damages you or any of that. But, you see lots of fan pages, and there's nothing we can do about those. Now, were they to cross the line and say things that were untrue, or to portray our clients in what we call the legal term false light, or any of those things, then we would immediately go after them. But it's just a sign of the times.
So you actually had to create like a team here that.
Yeah, it's just a skill set that we have to learn. Our paralegals and our some of our support personnel primarily do that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Also going back to technology, well, first, how did you meet Ava DuVernay that you became, she became a client? How did that happen?
Again, I think this goes to an earlier discussion we had about how I meet clients, because I don't have all the benefit of frankly, being one of the guys and getting that call all the time that says, oh, has to be you, Nina. I wish it happened more often. It does happen. I'm not saying it doesn't, but that's not how, I didn't have the benefit of that in starting my career. So I had to kind of get out and hustle. And so Ava was actually working as a publicist for many of my clients. She was a publicist for Gina Prince Bythewood. I think she also worked on a Casey Lemons movie. She worked for any number of my clients. And one of the things that I really pride myself on, not as a thing I've tried to cultivate as a personality trait, but I think I'm always very interested in other people. I'm always asking people questions. Where is the
sound man before? Yes, we witnessed that.
About themselves. And so the idea that I could be around Ava through a number of client pictures and not ask her who she was, what she was doing, what her aspirations were, that just wasn't going to happen. So she and I just became friends. And at one point, she started something, I can't wait till she does her version of this. Oh my God, it's going to be so hot. She started this thing called the Urban Beauty Collective. And what it was, remember, she's a publicist. So, and it started on VHS and then migrated to DVD. And then by the time it would have become just digital, her career had moved past it. So she'll go to Paramount, Sony, Warner Brothers, and she'll say, I have this DVD, 50 minutes of playing time, an hour of playing time, whatever it is. I'll put you on it, your production on it, if you pay me X amount of dollars. And in that way, she sold all the time on this. And then we essentially she signed up beauty salons. Because one of the things that's true, especially about women of color, is we spend a lot of time in beauty salons if we go to beauty salons. So it's kind of a captive audience. And we would have she had all kinds of incentives for the beauty salons, because at the end of the tape, there would be like a beauty salon of the week or the month or whatever. And you got to show your stuff, and it was only Black beauty salons. And this thing became incredibly lucrative. And it was the money she made on that allowed her to finance her first film entirely herself. And so when she came up with this Urban Beauty Collective idea, she and I worked on it together. She did all the hard work. I just gave her a lot of encouragement, and I was helping her with contracts and things like that. I mean, she couldn't really pay me because there wasn't a lot of money involved. It was kind of a quantity business. But she put them out, I think it was either once a week, once every 2 weeks, something like that. I can't remember. Maybe it was even once a month. But they would go out to beauty salons. And you have to remember, in some cases, we even made deals with hardware suppliers, because you get a captive audience who are going to sit there all day long and watch your trailer over and over and over again, right. Or watch an interview, or watch, and a lot of times it was product they had already made. They didn't make it especially for this. And she said, here's an audience I can bring to you. And I forgot, but there were like thousands of beauty salons all through the country, urban beauty salons, Yeah, so it's called the Urban Beauty Collective.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first things that she and I worked on together. And then she had the money together, and she was going to make, at this point, she'd already been doing, she'd been moving into filmmaking. She always says, I went to what do they call them, the extras on DVD? I went to the extras film school, because she would just literally look at all of those and hear the director's commentary, and that's really how she learned filmmaking. And she's very smart. But so she was doing some work in television primarily, for BET and other places, and she had enough money to make her first film, like $50,000. And we were talking about it, and she was like, oh, should I make this film, or should I use a down payment for a house. And everyone she went to said, buy your house, don't make the film, use other people's money, never use your own money. And I think and I'm sure I wasn't the only person when she came to me, and I was like, no, you better make that movie, because no one's going to make that movie but you, and no one's going to give you any money to make that movie. So it's a movie about black women. Who wants to make that? You know what I mean? Let's just be realistic. No.
Oh.
This was called I Will Follow.
Oh. Good advice.
Yeah. In retrospect, yeah. But
A risk.
But a risk. And she made the movie, and Ebert, Roger Ebert fell in love with it, reviewed it constantly, and then he wrote an article about her. What had happened is she, like me, had a family that loved the arts, and this is one of the things we have in common, and she had a beloved aunt who really is the character who the movie is based on, who took her to, and this is like another time and place. You used to be able to just go watch the people rehearse the Academy Awards, like literally. You're on the street, they're rehearsing, you can walk in. So her aunt took her to an Academy Award rehearsal, and they met Roger Ebert, and Roger Ebert and Ava, little Ava, took a thumbs up picture. And after he reviewed Middle of Nowhere, she sent it to him. And he wrote her back something like, oh, we were much younger then. And then shortly after that, he wrote the most incredibly poignant article about her, and used the picture in the article as a centerpiece of the article, about how he too had come to love the movies and the arts because of a beloved aunt, and how he felt so strongly that this movie talked about the loss of a loved one in a way that very few movies did. And it launched her career.
Relationships again.
So it was all relationships.
Wow.
So that's how Ava and I became.
Wow. Well, with 13th, was there anything unusual about how you negotiated that deal? And is negotiating for a platform like Netflix different than the traditional?
It was very different, and that was a very early Netflix deal. So we were all kind of just finding our way. The nice thing about it is that Netflix, and particularly their head of documentary, Lisa Nishimura, who's just like a goddess as far as I'm concerned, just basically said, what do you want to make? That's one of the luxuries when you're not time and date specific as to release. What do you want to make? And it kind of morphed. It didn't start out as a documentary. It became. It just, as she dug into it in a way that I think is so wonderful about documentary filmmaking, she just found her subject, and it crystallized, and it became 13th. And, but it was really all about Lisa and Ted, Sarandos, and there's just a mandate they had where they wanted to be in business with certain creative people, and it became, what do you want to do? And that's how 13th came about.
Another project that I'm sure you worked on her with was Queen Sugar, and what is interesting to me about that is she hires female directors.
Exclusively.
Yeah. And were you involved at all with that creative choice?
No, that creative choice is really all Ava's. We talked about it, but it's really all Ava's. I think Queen Sugar is kind of interesting for a number of reasons from the deal-making perspective. So now Ava has done Selma. She's met Oprah. It was a book that Oprah had optioned. Oprah gives it to Ava, and Ava's larger vision of it is, if you really think this one through, this is so obvious, but like many obvious things, it's not what's depicted in the media. The majority of African Americans in this country made their living as farmers, whether they were farming as property or farming as sharecroppers or as farming on their own. But you never ever see a farming family, for the most part black or white, depicted in television, because
from their point of view, right?
From any point of view, think about how many television shows can you think of once you get past, kind of the early 60s or so, where people live on a farm and work that farm, but yet that's a big part of the American story. And maybe that's one of the issues in television, that we don't tell enough American stories. So the story of Queen Sugar is a quintessential American story of a family whose legacy is farming. and all the complications that arise from them having once been property that farmed, and their transition to being owners. And it's a wonderfully engaging story. But I really think that in large part that it got made because of not only Ava's vision, Oprah Winfrey, but also, quite frankly, Susan Rovner at Warner Horizon. Susan understood this from the very first moment that Ava and Oprah brought it to her. And I don't know that it would have been made there without her. And she deserves so much credit for having been the person who had the foresight. And I think that's why we say things like representation matters, because I don't know that the guy who would have typically been in that position 10, 15 years, maybe even 5 years ago, would have so much gotten why a story about an African American family whose connection to the land was visceral.
Yeah.
In the way that Susan did. And Susan got that story, although she's a city girl. She went to Barnard like me. And Susan and I are also connected through our local Barnard Club.
Who is it?
I know.
It's interesting. We talked to a lot of female directors, and one of the recurring sort of themes is that the feeling that they get one shot to make an impression, and if they screw up in any way, then they don't get that second shot. Do you see that?
Oh, it's worse than that, because they have to get the one shot to screw up. Because this is the incredible thing about our business. Women must be taught to do something. Men learn by doing. Women learn by being taught to do, and then they can do. So you see, and I'm a real student of this. A lot of times, this is just how weirdly insane I was. I will sit down with, IMDb and Variety Insight, and I'll just look at all of these things, and I'll look at people's credits and draw their careers. And a lot of times, what you see is that men have been mentored by other men and get these incredible opportunities to direct, especially in episodic television. And if they don't do such a great job, they get another opportunity, as they should, as we all should, because you learn by your mistakes, and if this is what you're meant to do, you get better. But women are often asked to shadow I had a client who shadowed for almost an entire season, a bunch of different shows before she got her first opportunity to direct. So when they say Ava's hired a bunch of female directors, another way of saying this is Ava has hired a number of very experienced filmmakers who others felt that their experience as filmmakers didn't translate to their being able to direct television. Since she doesn't believe that, and she believes that moving from one medium to another is doable, she simply hires them based on their artistic integrity as filmmakers.
Do you see that becoming more of a standard than an aberration?
I think it will, in some ways, always be an aberration, because there's so much of a reluctance to kind of put yourself on the line and hire that person who's never worked before, because we're just in such a forgiving economic climate, But the nice thing about it is that the people that she has hired, she teases it all the time. She says, she hires someone and then she can't hire them again because she can't get them again because they're so busy working on other things that they're unavailable to her.
Amazing.
So she takes the chance. They do wonderful work, and then then the rest of the business just embraces them.
Do you see a lot of other clients going from film to TV? There seems to be a movement now that there's like golden age of television, or
again, part two.
Part two.
Part two.
Do you see that, and why do you think that's happening?
Well, first of all, because especially for women, there was a period of time in the last recent years where kind of the opportunities, all the really good, juicy, creative opportunities for women in front of the camera were in television. When you look at people who have gone to television from the film world, they're doing spectacular things. You know, I think of Glenn Close as being someone who was one of the first major movie stars to do that. And so, yeah, I think they went where the work was, and God bless us in television for having presented those opportunities. And, you know, not so good things to say about people in film who didn't.
I want to talk about some more of your clients. Well, actually, you mentioned that you had been just speaking with someone from Marvel before. I want to talk about Black Panther for a moment. Were you involved in the negotiations for your client, Ta-Nehisi Coates? And I'm curious who owned the rights to the characters in the comic of Black Panther.
Marvel owns everything. Okay.
And how did that? How did that come down?
I wasn't as involved in I wasn't involved in negotiating Ta-Nehisi's comic book deal. I came into Ta-Nehisi's life at the point where people were coming to him to start doing screenplays, and that's what I've been working with him primarily on. And you know, I think that's something that he's working on a screenplay right now, and I think he's going to be very successful at it. But I think Marvel also understood that, you know, the Black Panther characters in comic book had been created by two white guys, you know, in I think the 60s. And if they were going to be successful, they had to be reconceptualized and seen through the eyes of a contemporary, you know, African American, in Ta-Nehisi's case, man. And that's how he came to reconceptualize as an employee of Marvel. I mean, they own it all. They're not.
Right.
They're far too brilliant to let anyone.
I see. Okay. Is that hard to negotiate or to sort of guide someone? And what is your role?
It's like you've caught a tornado by the tail, or a tiger by the tail, and you're just hanging on for dear life, because I can't even imagine what it's like for someone to go from relative anonymity. Yeah. And I say relative because Lupita comes from a very rich and storied family history, in the sense of having been around and part of a well-known family for her entire life. But I can't imagine what it's like to go from zero to. For her, I think in some ways, I wouldn't say it was easy, because it's never easy for anyone, but coming from such a secure foundation, family life, having, you know, had this world view of herself, not being African American. You know, she's not. She's an African woman, African Mexican, but she's not. So she has a different perspective, and she wasn't a kid when this happened. You know, she was in her late 20s, early 30s. So she had lived somewhat and done jobs. You know, she worked as a production assistant for Amir Anar. You know, she's lived out in the world. So she, I think, was able to take this better, and she has a very clear sense of self, which I think helped her.
Is there any cautionary tale that you would offer to someone in that position, from your experience?
I would simply say, trust your instincts in terms of the early associations that you make, and try to stay with them if they're competent to do the work for you, and they add value, because those are the things that you can count on. You know, those people and who saw talent in you early and took a chance on you then. And it doesn't mean blind allegiance, but it does mean that often, if those are the right people and if they can still continue to do the work for you, that's a good thing. And you should, and stay grounded, you know, and it helps if you have family and friends who can help you stay grounded.
What client's been with you the longest?
Oh gosh, I have a ton of clients who've been with me forever. Some more active, not as active now as they were early in their career. Like I said, Bill Boulware, who went on to create a television show, co-create a television show, 227, and who worked on a lot of different shows. Not as active in television now, but Bill was my first client. Oh gosh, James Earl Jones. Heard of him, right?
Forget about it.
Forget about him. He's another person like Bob Guillaume, who probably hired me maybe sooner than I was really ready to represent him, but he I caught up.
You represent Lena Waithe,
Yes.
who just had a historic Emmy win last year.
We just had a historic year.
She did.
Yeah.
Talk about how something like an Emmy or a major award impacts negotiations for like the Showtime deal she has now.
Well, I would say I would look at it in another perspective. I think one of the biggest impacts on negotiations now has been the legislation passed in California and New York and a number of other states, which doesn't allow employers to ask about your employment history.
Meaning your pay history or your
pay history. Yeah. The California law went into effect on January 1, the New York law at the end of December. And that has been the biggest sea change that I've seen in some time, because typically what happened is you presented your employment pay history to an employer, and then you negotiated as best you could based on your leverage. And often someone would say to you, I'm not going to pay you more because I don't pay X% over someone's last deal. Or in the negotiations for the Crown, which I was not part of, but like all of us, I observed from the outside, you might be the star of this. He might be clearly second to you. You might be the thing that drives the engine, but he was paid more than you in the past, so I'm going to pay him more now. As opposed to being able to go in and say, she's going to be the queen. She's going to be the center of this universe. And this is what that person should be paid. That is something that we have the ability to do now. Now, of course, at the end, it always comes down to leverage. How much do they want that person, and what are their alternatives? But if they want the person a lot and the alternatives are few, then you have the leverage to make a good deal. And that, I think, has been perhaps the biggest thing that has changed in the last 90 to 120 days in terms of the way we negotiate. And I think it impacted, for the most part, I found, not for the most part, exclusively I found in my practice this pilot season, it meant tremendous gains in the deals that I negotiated.
So if you can't look retroactively, can you look laterally? Are you aware of what co-stars are making? And
you look at your bottom line and what you're willing to pay. Yeah, ultimately you know what everyone is making, and in some cases you know the employment history because you employed the person. But it becomes down to, you can't discuss it in negotiations. You know? You can't say to someone, what did you make the last time? And here's what I'm going to pay you based on that.
Well, I'm also thinking about All the Money in the World and how that happened. And if you have any insight into the pay disparity between Mark Wahlberg and Michelle Williams and
you know, I don't represent either one of them,
Sure.
so I saw that from the outside as and any number of people. I had some insight, you know, I had some inside information on some of it, but a lot of it goes back to this issue of who makes the decision about the product? Why does so much of the product that we see on TV and in film, why is it driven by the male narrative? And when it's driven by the male narrative, of course the male actor becomes more important, gets the credit for the success, and has the ability to negotiate for more. So as we change the industry as a whole, as we change and there are more women and other kinds of people making these decisions, we're going to see a change in the product, and we're going to see more parity in the payment. You know, it is a little puzzling how two people in the same talent agency might not know or might have. I think that the thing that I understood, which has been widely reported in the press, is that she understood that no one was making more for these reshoots. Now, it doesn't address the issue of why her base pay relative to her co-star's base pay was so much less. That was a result of her employment history and, again, the sense of who drives the narrative.
So is something do you routinely do this now where you have some sort of clause where even if you don't know what the numbers are, they can't make more or
I
less
say it all
than-
the time. I say it in every deal.
Oh,
Every deal.
how is it? What is that called? A favored nation or a what?
Well,
would be-
first of all, the notion of favored nations as to any number of provisions has always existed. You know, no more favorable treatment as to how pick a credit. No more favorable treatment as to any number of things. Now we're saying no more favorable treatment as to pay, which typically was never done because pay was always precedential as opposed to, you know, particular. And for the most part, I'm finding that people are saying, no, I won't put it in the contract, but we'll say, you know, either they're saying, you've taken all the money, Nina, so there is no more, there is no chance that anyone else is going to make more. I get that a lot. Or they say, I can't contractually agree to that, but I can tell you that no one, you know what I mean, that your client, no one is going to make more money than your client. Yeah.
We'll see what happens now. I
Yeah,
guess.
we'll
That's
see
gonna
what
be
happens.
changing.
But you know what? The thing about it is, just like the Crown, someone leaked that information. Okay? So unless you can keep it a big secret, you're better off just making, you know, biting the bullet and dealing with the parity issues in an upfront and more fair way.
Right, right.
Yeah. I'm sure the producers would say, you know what, let's tell the world that we paid her less. That would be a great idea. And the thing about that situation, which again I was not involved in, you have to think, at the end of the first season of The Crown, she's a star. She might not have been the star walking into it, but she's the nominated, award-winning nominated. You would now have a chance to go to her and her representatives and say, we think this is deserving of more money. And you don't do it because that's not how it's typically done in our business. But think about how different that narrative would have been, that public face it would have been, if those guys had been able to say, now going into year one, it was very clear that she was not paid as much, but we knew that could not be the case going into year two. And in fact, we even made up for the pay disparity in year one. And I wouldn't have had to deliver a check for $275,000 to her a couple of weeks ago.
Wow. Well, you're definitely changing the conversation about this now, which we'll get into in depth. I wanted just one more of your clients who, just for television's sake, that we can't leave out is Arsenio.
I know. I love Arsenio.
Were you? When did you start working with him? Did
Well,
you work
remember,
on the
I
late
didn't.
night?
I didn't work on the first Arsenio show.
Okay.
I wasn't old, and I mean, I hadn't been practicing long enough. You know, Arsenio and I are very close in age, and I was in law school, and you know, doing.
Wow.
And the show might have actually started a few years after I started practicing, but I was very young and in the infancy of my practice, so I did not make the deal for him. But I came to know him because we had a number of my clients were doing the show. So I was, you know, again, I'm going to talk to you. Like one of my kids, my older girl, always says, like, oh God, you talk to everyone. Please stop talking to people. But you know. So I started to get to know Arsenio, and we became friends, and we both had a very, he more so than me, but we both had a close relationship with Sammy Davis Jr., which is really what bound us to each other. So anyway.
How did you know Sammy?
Okay. So again, I'm talking to everyone. When I moved to California, my father was just about to retire. He had been a civil servant. You know, almost everyone in my family, once the civil servant jobs became more, my mom was working in the post office and in the Department of Motor Vehicles. My stepdad was at NYPD, and my dad was working for SoCal Edison. Okay, so he retires because you get a pension, and he becomes the chauffeur for Sidney Poitier.
No way.
Yes.
Amazing.
And Sidney and my dad become best friends, fast buddies, except that, and the biggest thing, of course, I guess I can tell this, maybe Joanna will see this, but I think she kind of knew this anyway. So, of course, Sidney's not supposed to drive because he's had some surgery or something, I say hip or knee, something, I don't know what it is, but he's not supposed to drive. So what he does is my dad pulls out of their driveway and immediately they switch. And Sidney's driving and my dad's in the passenger seat. And I remember one day I'm driving down the 10 and I see them and they don't see me. And they're so busy talking to each other that even though I'm honking the horn, or maybe because he's Sidney, he's like, I'm not gonna look. And Sidney's driving, my dad's in the passenger seat. So anyway, so of course he introduces me to Sydney, and I have to tell you the level of welcome that I got, and not just me, but people like me got, because remember, there was never anyone like me. They went through generations, they went through years of working, and they never saw, for the most part, professionals who looked like them. Not in agencies, not in managers, not in lawyers. So they were so lovely and wonderful and welcoming to me. And I was almost like their, like their pet rock or something. Or like, look at Nita Shaw.
Yeah.
It's like
The daughter they want to boast about.
Yeah, they would have boasted about me. She's a lawyer. You see this little thing over here? She's a lawyer. It was just like, really, they were that. I mean, so anyway, I was, this is such an absurd story, but I have to tell a story. So I'm practicing for a few years, and I become friends with Suzanne DePass and Altafiz Davis, Sammy's wife. And I said to Suzanne, we should have a gathering of kind of black women in the business, all 10 of us or whatever. There weren't a lot of us, but there were kind of when we finally all got together. And then Sammy says, you know what? Have it at my house. Everyone will come.
Yeah.
So I give this party at Sammy Davis Jr.'s house, which was right behind the Beverly Hills Hotel. It's absurd. I mean, now I look back on it, and it's crazy, right? I'm like 27 years old, and I'm inviting everyone to a house at a party at Sammy Davis Jr. and Altaviz's home. And Sammy is wonderful. He's everything you see in terms of he's on stage 24/7. He comes up, hey, and he comes out, he meets everyone, and he welcomes everyone to their home, and he's got all kinds of crap on his wall from this movie or that movie, and and I'm like, things signed from Frank Sinatra. It's crazy. It's just insane. I can't, now that I think about it, I mean, first of all, you have to be like 27 to even ask Sammy Davis if you could have a party at his house, right? Because now that I'm an adult, grown-up lady, I would like,
No, you'd be too scared to.
I'd be too afraid to, but at the time, it seemed like a real logical thing. Couldn't have at my house on the Miracle Mile, right?
And everybody came.
And everyone came.
Everybody plus one. I'm sure.
Oh yeah. So I began to have these parties where I would invite women in the industry, women of color in the industry, and these parties went for a couple of years, and they were very popular, and they made me very well known. And I kind of became known to Sydney and Sammy, and then a number of people in my family were musicians, but like more kind of like journeyman musicians. They played at night, they played, and as a result, I had a connection to a family member had a connection to Clarence Avant, who is Nicole Avant's dad, and Nicole is married to Ted Sarandos. Okay, everybody's connected.
Yeah.
Everyone's connected in some way. And I had a client who, I don't even remember the name of this person, who had left me because they had gotten to know Quincy, and Quincy had introduced them to his lawyer. So I needed to get to Quincy and explain to him that he could not do that ever again, right? And I felt like if he got to know me, right, he would not do that.
Of course.
Of course. So I got to get to Quincy. So I called my relative who was a horn player and who knew Clarence, because Clarence was huge in the music business and The Godfather.
You never met Quincy from your days at Tandem with Lear?
No, he's like I'm
Okay.
down here.
Okay.
I'm like, it feels like it, but I'm a little lowly production lawyer. So, so I called Clarence and I introduced myself and I explained that I'm so-and-so's goddaughter from New York, and he says, and I told him this whole story. And Clarence is like, Quincy did that? So he takes me over to Quincy's office, and then Quincy becomes my big champion.
Oh my gosh.
And I go, and then I'm like having lunch with Clarence and Quincy like a couple of times a year. And to this day, whenever Quincy sees me, he's always like, hey, baby, And
how did I ever let you go?
yeah, hey, baby. Hey, baby.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
The Giants. And just think about, like, because growing up, obviously, he must have been a huge name in
Oh,
your...
Sammy Davis Jr.? Oh my God.
Him and Quincy.
Yeah. Quincy less so because he's always been a little bit more behind the scenes, but then the Michael Jackson stuff, all of that stuff, you know, he's becomes huge. But he is Quincy Jones.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just,
But amazing.
yeah.
Yeah.
I literally, and it's also like kind of like the first time I meet George Lucas is kind of similar because what happens, I'm out of law school a couple of years, and you know, it's so funny, you're in these big law firms and everything, you have an office, and people come to the office and they think you're a big deal because you're in this big law firm and you have an office, even if you don't even have a secretary or anything, you're just like, you know, having to get other people coffee, but you're still looking like a big deal. So, this is like a really strange story. So a girlfriend of mine from law school called me and she said that her dad was a Tuskegee Airman and that he had just, he had learned that George Lucas was going to make a film about the Tuskegee Airmen, but he wasn't using any of the, he wasn't like in touch with it, the Tuskegee Airmen organization or any of the Tuskegee Airmen. And I was like, okay, well, and it was so cute. If you could imagine like me, little me sitting at my desk, the Tuskegee Airmen, the two men, they're like, you know, black men from the 40s. They're like suit, tie, vest. You know, my girlfriend from law school, who's their niece, probably great niece, several generations, because, you know, they're older men. And they showed me, they had written a letter to George Lucas. And and George Lucas had written a letter, his lawyer had written a letter back. And it was really, all in all, a very nice lawyer's letter. It wasn't one of those letters that as I read it, I said, you know what? This letter could have been so much worse. So I look at the letter and I notice that copied on the letter is, I'm scouring the letter trying to look for clues as to how I can help them. And I notice on the letter is copied Charles, C-H-A-S, period, Johnson. And I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chas- direct DP?
No, he's like a producer. He's been around forever.
We're trying to interview him, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
Charles Floyd Johnson.
Yeah.
So I don't know him, but I know Reuben Cannon. So I call Reuben and I ask him if he could introduce me to Charles Johnson. And he does. And Charles Johnson is like, oh, listen, we would love to work with the Tuskegee Airmen, but we heard that someone else had their rights. And we just didn't want to get into an interference thing, but if you could figure that out. So I go back to the Tuskegee Airmen and I explain this to them. And I then go back to Charles, and between Charles and George, and we managed to figure out a deal that allows George's company, Lucasfilm, to get control of those rights. And so I come back to this, and I think it's really kind of to bring this kind of full circle. So much of my career in television and in film has really been about just trying to figure out my way in an industry that wasn't necessarily looking out for me, how I had to look out for myself. So like I said, I didn't know anyone, as far as I knew, who knew George Lucas. I didn't feel like I could call George Lucas. I wasn't representing James Earl Jones at the time, where my connections to the Lucasfilm company then deepened because of the continual discussions about the Darth Vader character. So I just like looked at that letter. I remember holding that letter in my hand and just figuring out, how am I gonna fix this? How am I gonna get this done? And that's when I talked earlier about wanting to be a lawyer and the skill sets and what I felt I brought to it and I bring to it. That's the thing that I really love about what I do, is that I just looked at that piece of paper and that got me that recognition of a name, because I'm always reading everything. So even though I didn't know Charles Floyd Johnson, I knew who he was. Right. And I also knew, because he had worked for Stephen Cannell and worked with Stephen Cannell, and I knew Reuben had worked with Stephen Cannell. And then it turns out that Reuben and Charles were actually in the Universal mailroom together, and they were best friends.
We have a great story from Reuben about working in that mailroom.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's connections.
So it's just making those connections that has always been the hallmark of my career. So I'm lucky, I get into O'Melveny, I work on the Tandem TAT shows, I meet Norman Lear. I don't become best friends with him or anything, but I'm on his radar, and he kind of, you know, when he sees me, he knows who I am. And I pick up a skill set that takes me into the next phase of my career. And always I'm figuring out how I have to be ingenious, because no one is going to, I can't like rely on getting it done the way the guys get it done. I can't ever be part of that boys club in that way. I just can't, not at that time.
Right.
So I've always got to find a way. Now first I have to tell you, George Lucas couldn't have been lovelier through that whole thing, couldn't have been more helpful. Actually ended up making the deal that allowed him to control those rights, and then included the Tuskegee Airmen in every aspect. The movie then went dormant, and then many years later resumed as Red Tails.
Amazing.
At which point Charles Johnson asked me to represent him in that movie. So there you go.
Okay, now I'm going to bring a double loop full circle here, because now you're in a very different position now, where it's not like you have to go through all of these hoops to get these connections. You are Nina Shah. Everyone knows who you are. I want to talk about mentorships. I want to talk about you now trying to reach out to other women and helping them like other people have maybe been that for you. The Hollywood Reporter Women's in Entertainment Mentorship Program. Why are you a part of that? How did that happen? Why is it important?
It's important to me. Mentorship is important because I was really mentored. I mean, I would not be where I am today if people, in some cases really wonderful men like Ernie Dell, like Dixon Dern, like Michael Rubel, didn't stand up for me. And then, you know, when you're in something and you're like the only person, you can feel like all the fingers grasping for you to be there for them. And sometimes it's a really tremendous, I don't want to say burden, because it never feels burdensome, but it's a tremendous responsibility to not have done something. Because like I always say, like, there's no honor in being the first of anything if you're the last of it. I don't want to have had this great career and then the door closes and it closed and it was never, I don't want that. That to me would be, that would break my heart.
So what does this organization do to
Well,
correct that?
first of all, it mentors girls who are living in their community and going to schools in their community, which is very important. I'm involved in another organization that is very much about mainstreaming children into the independent or private school community, but this group is really much more about, can I take girls who are high achievers? These girls, for the most part, I think would go to college. Maybe they wouldn't go to Stanford and Berkeley, which is where they end up, but they would go. Yeah, and it's so funny too, because I wasn't in the first year of the program. I was in the second year, but part of the reason I was in the second year is I went to Stephen Galloway and just said, Stephen, you cannot have a program that mentors young women of color and they don't get to see women of color as their mentors. You can't sell that notion or perpetuate that notion that the only way up is through through white women. I said,
Right.
do you understand? They need to look at me and know that they can be me. They need to look at you know, Perlina or any of the other women who have been in the program and see us as tangible proof that they can succeed. So I kind of volunteered myself into the I volunteered. I became the second year, and I ended up mentoring a young Latina who, Sophia, who I adore, and who is now in a joint master's PhD program at Berkeley.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
So
She
what
got her undergraduate degree in engineering.
What advice or what piece of advice did you impart to her that you think is important to share to others?
I gave her no advice at all about her chosen subject, which is engineering and other sciences that I can't even begin to understand. What I felt like I gave Sophia was confidence. I remember of course, like all of us in the programming, before the program became as institutionalized as it is, it was me and Jeannie Newman and Melanie Cook and a bunch of us, and we were like, we are now going to push Nancy Josephson. We're pushing these girls. If these girls thought they were going to, Cal State Fullerton or no. Not that those aren't great schools, but these are great girls, and they're going to go where their true potential takes them. So in between her junior and senior year, I decided I would send Sophia to this program at Berkeley, a summer program, which I had to do, on my own dime and everything. So I sent her to this summer program, and about 2 days into the program, I get this email where you can practically read the tears.
Oh no.
Everyone here is so much better than me. Everyone knows about programming. Everyone does this. Everyone. I mean, it was just like this went on and on. I can't do any of this. And I wrote her back. I said, did any of the people there just learn how to speak English in the last 5 years like you? I said, come on now, let's be. So I was just kind of gave her the pep talk. I said, did everyone there just, leave their country and flee as a refugee? She was from El Salvador. And I just did any of them do that? I said, how do you discount yourself so much? Did any of their parents give up everything they were and everything they had to move their children to a country where they didn't speak the language, they didn't have any relatives, and they had to work jobs that were so beneath their skills? Did any of those people have any of that? All those people that you're talking about, I said, those people have things that you'll learn in a couple of years. You have things that those people will never learn. And if they do learn them, they'll learn from life lessons that will take tens of years. I said, so how dare you? Just go back. So, of course.
She did.
Yeah, she did. And it was really funny because when I went to her graduation, they have a special graduation for there's African American, Latino. So we went to the Latino graduation, me and her family, and literally everyone in her family comes up to my waist. They're all these little, so they're all these little people, and none of them speak English. Some of her aunts and uncles had come, to the United States for this, and I'm there and I'm having dinner with them, and it's just the weirdest thing. And her mom and dad, who now, of course, have their English has greatly improved, and her dad was actually a lawyer, but unable to practice here because we have all these crazy rules in this country. That somehow you have to be able to speak English to pass the bar when your client base is probably going to be almost entirely non-English speaking. But that's another story and for another time. So, but it was just so rewarding to be there with Sophia and her family.